Greetings once again, fellow nerdologists. Ambassador Kosh coming at you with a brand new video, and today, as the thumbnail and the title indicated, we're going to be continuing our 1980s pop culture series, and we're going to do a little bit of we're going to do something a little different. Anything kind of as this, we've been doing with the last few movies we've done been sci-fi and so on, and last one we did was Goonies. This one, it very much falls into the fantasy genre, and I think it's one that everybody is fairly familiar with, but I think it still deserves its own due, and that is the Dark Crystal. Now, a lot of you may have heard of the Dark Crystal in reference to the Netflix series that came out not too long ago. I'm not sure if it's still on, if it's ongoing or whatever, but I've heard it's been very well received. And the movie itself, it holds a very special place in 80s pop culture, and it has kind of stayed in the public consciousness ever since then. I remember seeing it in theaters when it originally released, and it just absolutely captivated me as a young man, as a kid. And the thing I did not realize about this movie, and it's something that I don't think anybody knew at the time or anything, there was not a single actual person on screen. All of this was done with puppets. And you had the master of puppetry in charge of this beauty of a movie, and that's the late Jim Henson. And the interesting thing is, it was actually his studio that his wife and son, I believe, or anything, have carried on after his passing. And the Dark Crystal is a very mythologically deep film, and Jim Henson wrote it as such. And the great thing about this, you didn't have just Jim Henson, who was the visionary mind behind this, but you had one of the best puppeteers at the time, and he's got a connection to Star Wars, obviously, and that's Frank Oz, who, for most everybody who knows, Frank Oz is best known for doing the puppetry work and the voice of Master Yoda, both in the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, and I think he reprised his role in The Last Jedi, sadly. But, yeah, Dark Crystal, even for the 1980s, it stood out from everything else that was coming out at the time because you didn't know a lot about this world. You had this very brief overview or voiceover at the start of it, and you just kind of got sunk into the movie. I remember they did a anniversary re-release and everything, a limited re-release through AMC and everything. And when I found out about it, I was tugging like a little kid on my wife's arm saying, I want to go see this. I want you to go with me. And she's like, I got this for you on Blu-ray because you told me it meant so much to you. And it was actually one of the very first Blu-rays that I ever got because I just recently gotten a Blu-ray player shortly after me and my wife had started dating. And it was at that time, it was a long-distance relationship because we lived 2 hours apart from one another. But she's like, I want to get you something. She's like, for you, being you just got your Blu-ray player, she's like, what can I get you? I was like, there's a movie from my childhood that I really like if you want to get that for me. She's like, well, what's it called? I was like, it's called The Dark Crystal. And the cool thing was she was able to find it, but it was actually in a box set and everything. It was The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. And believe it or not, even as a kid of the 80s, I never watched The Labyrinth all the way through. And I may do that and everything. I may do a live watch party for those of you who might be interested. If you are, comment down below. We might do a live watch party and watch Labyrinth all the way through for the first time for me and everything. I mean, I've seen clips of it, but I've never seen it all the way through. But when the package arrived and everything, and I opened it, it had Dark Crystal, but it also had Labyrinth. But I'm like, yes! She really does love me. She really does get me because Dark Crystal is one of my favorite childhood movies, and even as I got older, it was still one that held a very special place in my mind and my heart. And just the richness of the world and the characters, because you have the main character Jin, who's is one of the last surviving members of a race called Gelflings, and Jin was okay as a character. I like the female Gelfling. I think her name was Kira, a little bit more. But the two races that really left a lasting impression on me, and I think this is true of a lot of people, were the Mystics and the Skeksis. And the you throughout the movie you get these very brief voiceovers explaining each race and their relationship to the Dark Crystal and so on. And as the main character Jen goes on this journey to heal the crystal, you start to get a picture of what this world was once like and what it is and how it has become a very dark and very grim place. But even so, there's still this little spark of life that still exists in it that hasn't been snuffed out by the Skeksis. And the neat thing about the Skeksis and the Mystics is you can almost sense that there's a connection between the two races, but you can't quite you don't realize it until the very end just how they are very much related to one another. And I'll go into how much so anything during this video. But the Skeksis are they're almost a cross between avian bird creatures and a little bit reptilian in how they react and how they behave. And they almost look like, well, to be very candid, they look like overgrown buzzards because they've got these long beaked shaped heads and everything. But the amazing thing is, even though these were entirely done through puppetry, there's so much character and so much nuance in every character, in every Skeksis and every mystic. And what you get with the mystics is they're these very passive, very restrained characters, and they have access to this mystical power that allows them to manipulate the world around them, but there's almost an effort and a way to anytime they exert this mystical ability. And honestly, I almost kind of could draw a parallel between the mystics and possibly how Yoda's race might be. And everything, even though you've only seen two, well now three of Yoda's species on screen in Star Wars or anything that's Star Wars related, you could almost see the mystics and Yoda's species existing in the same space and the same universe even. But at the same time they're not. But this movie was revolutionary for its time because it was done completely through puppetry. There was no actual people on screen in the movie. Or even if they are on screen, they're inside these giant suits and everything that they have to manipulate with their bodies. And it's a very high form of puppetry. And that's what Jim Henson was specialized in because he did puppetry so much. He was one of the creative minds behind Sesame Street and the Muppets, Kermit, Miss Piggy, and all of them. But what Jim Henson wanted to do with this movie was to create a mythological tale, a fairy tale, in essence. But he wanted to do it without actually having people on screen acting. He wanted the performances to come through these puppets, and it very much does so. It's very It's a very rich world, and for the time and the technology that was available to filmmakers, they utilized every trick in the book that they could. You had these glass matte paintings that you had for the big wide landscape shots, and you had these miniatures particularly for the castle of the crystal, and you have the sets and everything. Then these are large massive sets because they have to be, because you've got to have room for the film crew to move around and work in. You have to have room for the performers in these suits to move around and work in. And everything has to be very carefully staged and storyboarded, because it takes so much time and effort to film these puppets that if you have one goof up or one screw up or anything during filming, you've got to go back and completely reset everything. And the great thing about the Blu-ray edition of the Dark Crystal is you've got, I think, like at least two documentaries on how they did the Dark Crystal, the process that they went through in designing the creatures and the world, and how they put everything together. And the work that went into this movie was massive, and it was, honestly, it was a passion project, you could almost say, of Jim Henson, because he believed in the power of doing performance through puppetry to evoke a emotional response out of people. And honestly, for a lot of people, myself included, this very much was the case, because even though these were puppets and everything that you saw on screen, when something would happen to them, you would empathize with them, you would feel for them, even as much as you would for a real life person on screen. And you could almost make the argument that you have we've gotten so far advanced in computer technology and so on. You have these CGI puppets that you see on screen now, and even though you may realize it's a CGI character, you still feel for them. You still have an emotional connection to them, and you care about what their fate's going to be, and you care about what they're going through at the time. And I think that's one of the really neat things that inspired a lot of innovation in filmmaking and everything, particularly with what Jim Henson's studio has done throughout its existence, is they pushed the envelope of what you could do in puppetry. And honestly, The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and everything, to a degree and everything, had an impact on filmmakers down the road, because they realized that, yeah, you had what Jim Henson did on Sesame Street and on the Muppets and everything, but then you have him do this giant leap and do something that's so far removed from traditional puppetry and everything. Just a person that's got the arm up inside of a puppet, and you've got these people who are in these full body suits and everything, and they're doing these performances and everything, and they can't really they don't have a line of sight or anything else, but there's such character and such depth to all these species that exist in this world. And I think you can see the next technological leap from puppetry to CGI puppetry, CGI characters, and CGI graphics and everything. And you could almost see a little bit of that in the episode 1 of Phantom Menace, when Lucas asks Frank Oz to come back and reprise his role and do a younger version of Yoda. And you see the complexity of that Yoda puppet. And it's a younger version of Yoda, obviously, but you don't, even though you know in your mind this is a puppet, this isn't a real person, you still make that emotional connection with Yoda. And you see Frank Oz's effort and work in portraying this character that he had done so many years prior. And thanks to Jim Henson and Frank Oz, they gave us this very rich mythological story that resonates so well, even not just in the 1980s, but decades later. People still remember this movie. They remember the impact it had on them personally, and it's such a rich and beautiful world, and it just evokes such a um, reaction from you that you can't help but want to know more about this world. And I'm so glad that Netflix is working with Jim Henson's studio and doing this prequel series, Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, I think it's called. And I'm eventually going to pick up a copy whenever they release it on Blu-ray. I'm hoping they do it eventually because I very much want to revisit this world. So my recommendation and everything is, if you've never seen the Dark Crystal, I would highly recommend that you find a copy of it. You can find it just about anywhere on Blu-ray, and I recommend you get the Blu-ray edition of it. If you can find the twin set, I think you can probably get it on Amazon or whatever. Um, if you can get the twin set that's got both the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, by all means get both and watch them, because even if you're not a kid of the '80s, but you were exposed to Dark Crystal at some time in your past, and you thought, this was okay, but not really for me, I suggest give it another shot, because even now, at the age of 41, the Dark Crystal still evokes a very strong reaction out of me, and it helps me to reconnect with my childhood, and it reconnects with that childlike innocence that still exists, I think, in all of us. But yeah, I will say there is a heck of a twist at the end of the Dark Crystal, and you kind of get snippets of it throughout the movie. And half I'm torn between whether or not I should tell you the twist here, but I think I'm going to go ahead and just, because I have a penchant for blurting out well, not blurting out, but giving spoilers for things. But just on the offhand that you never have the opportunity, or you haven't had the opportunity to see the Dark Crystal, um, the twist at the end of the movie, and it's actually a really good one. You find out that the Skeksis and the Mystics are actually the same race. They're referred to, I think, in the credits as the Skeksis, and they were this alien race that came to the world and everything. And the Dark Crystal, or the Crystal of Truth, as they refer to it as, already existed in this world, and the Skeksis try to manipulate the crystal for their own ends. And what ends up happening, not only do they crack the crystal, but they crack themselves, and they split into these two different separate races, the Mystics and the Skeksis. And there's this other prophecy that's connected with it that says that Gelfling, Jin and Kira's race, will heal the crystal and reunite the Skeksis and the Mystics into their pure and perfect form. And eventually, at the end of the movie, the Skeksis do leave this world and do leave the world. I think it's called Thra or something along those lines. So I hope y'all enjoyed this or anything, and stay tuned. More is to come. And as always, like, share, and subscribe these. And until next time, my friends, I have always been here.